So thank you all for joining this the author session. With those sessions, we really want to provide a space for in-depth discussion on a recent publication, and we're very grateful to have you all here, and also have a participating number of attendees participating today as well. The publication that we focus on today is a review of both the academic and grade literature on the public health, environmental, animal welfare, and socioeconomic implications of plant-based meat substitutes and cell-based meat. And this work was led by the Center for a Livable Future at Johns Hopkins University. And Raychel Santo, who's the lead author of this study, will be presenting here today. She has also brought with her two of her co-authors, Rand Kim and Jan Dudkovic, and we're really glad to have you all here. I want to keep this introduction very brief to leave as much time as possible for the discussion. Let me get to my next slide. Yeah, so the agenda, I think, is really straightforward. Raychel will kick off with a 5-minute presentation, and then we will have about 35 minutes for Q&A and discussion, and then about 5 minutes wrap up. And after this, we will leave space for an informal discussion of about 15 minutes for those people who are interested in that. So a few notes on housekeeping. That is, please be aware that this session will be recorded and we may share it later on our website. For the participants in this session, if you want to speak, please raise your virtual hand to indicate so. And I also wanted to highlight that we have a Q&A section open for questions and comments that we'll try to bring into the discussion as well. So I think that's really it from me. With that, I want to hand over to Raychel for a presentation about the research. So the floor is to you, Raychel.
Thank you, Walter, and thank you for inviting us today to present on our paper and field this conversation. I'm really excited and, to be honest, a little honored to be here amongst many of you who I've read many of your papers and are kind of some of my food system researcher ideal dream jobs in the future. So I'm really honored to be here. So my colleagues and I work, well, everyone except for Jan, who was working as a postdoc at Hopkins at the time. The rest of our team works at the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future, which is an academic center based at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. And our work really works on making a healthier, more equitable, and more resilient food system. And we generally approach our work with a food system public health lens. So as you can imagine, that's part of the reason that we focused our paper on a pretty broad spectrum of topics, but mostly around public health and food system implications of both plant-based and cell-based meats. And we came to this research topic because we had heard a lot of media discussions and consumer discussions around the potential health and environmental benefits of these meat alternatives. And we wanted to look at what the academic research says and kind of critically evaluate their purported benefits and highlight some of the nuances where the research could be expanded and where some of the conversations could go in the future. And so we focused our review on 5 categories of implications: public health, environmental, animal welfare, economic, and policy implications. I will admit with a caveat that the policy implications are pretty focused on US policy. So I would open it up for conversation since many of you are from Europe. Would love to hear some of your opinions about whether the policy discussions are similar in Europe or different, and how so. Because we're a mostly American authorship team, we didn't feel it appropriate to dive into the EU policy implications as well. So would love to hear your opinions about that. I'm going to do a brief one-slide overview of some of the findings. I believe everyone who's attending has already read the paper, but I will just do a brief overview so we can be on the same page, and then we can dive into questions. From a public health perspective, one of our biggest implications is that it's still relatively unknown the extent to which meat substitutes, meat analogs, meat alternatives offer similar nutritional or chronic disease benefits compared to conventional meats, as if you were to replace conventional meats with whole legumes. In the case of plant-based meat alternatives, the impacts are likely going to vary based on whether you're replacing processed or unprocessed foods in the diet. And in terms of cell-based meat, some of the purported health benefits are largely speculative at this point because a lot of the research was still hypothetical modeling and processes. And we'll see as some of these products come onto the market in the next few years. So I hope we'll see more research into their public health considerations. I'll also mention that we looked into potential antibiotic use considerations, food safety, and also occupational and community health. And all of these areas really hadn't been discussed much in the existing scientific literature. So we're looking and calling out for more research in that area. From an ecological perspective, our big findings are it's important to be specific when you're making comparisons between meat alternatives and the products which they're intended to replace. And when comparing to beef, which generally has the highest environmental impact for most considerations, most meat alternatives, whether plant-based or cell-based, generally look better, provide substantial and ecological benefits. And compared to other animal products, it differs. In the case of plant-based meat substitutes, the benefits are either less pronounced or potentially non-existent, as many of the cell-based meat studies thus far have shown that a lot of the ecological impacts are pretty similar to poultry, pork, and other animal products. From an animal welfare perspective, meat alternatives could substantially reduce the number of animals raised and killed for human consumption, assuming that there is a direct replacement and that people aren't just adding more meat alternatives to their diets, or that meat, and that it's actually replacing existing production. But there are a lot of assumptions in that, and further research into how meat alternatives are changing the market dynamics and whether they're actually leading to changes in overall production are definitely merited. And there are also some considerations. I believe some of you are actually involved in the production of cell-based meat, so you might know more of the behind-the-scenes scoop on which products and in terms of fetal bovine serum, some of the other inputs that currently, at least in the academic literature, currently rely on animal-based inputs might be changing. And I know this market is rapidly changing even since we did the study almost a year ago now. So further innovation is needed, but I imagine that some of those products will change over the next few years. From an economic perspective, we pointed out that a lot more research is needed on how the growth in the meat alternative industry could impact considerations around industry consolidation, the welfare of producers and workers, and of rural communities who are highly dependent on agriculture as a current economic driver. And lastly, as I mentioned, our policy debate was mostly focused on the US policy considerations, but these were centering on safety approvals, which agencies would provide regulatory oversight, and how to label such products and whether they can be considered meat or have to bear some additional label to notify consumers that they might be imitation products or something like that. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so we can dive into some of the discussion, and would love to hear your comments. And if you have other ideas that were sparked by the paper, would love to hear those too.
Great, thank you very much, Rachel. So yeah, please, if you have a question, just raise your hand. I can maybe kick off with one short question which I had, was that I wonder if there were any specific points that really stood out to you or things that through the process of building this review that you, I don't know, weren't aware of that really stood out to you.
I think the thing I was most surprised by was how different products. I already was familiar with a lot of the existing literature on existing animal products and with beef's impacts and other animal products like poultry and pork, and how much those differ. I didn't expect to see that the meat alternatives would be kind of on par with a lot of the other, at least from an environmental, from greenhouse gas footprint especially. I didn't expect them to see that they'd be pretty on par with some of those other animal products because of the way that they tend to be promoted, which generally is comparing to beef. So the statistics look pretty good. And I hadn't really dug into the research prior to that. So I thought that was interesting, that in my head, I was imagining that the impacts would be probably better than they did turn out for some of those other animal products.
A question from Johan.
Yeah, thank you, Walter. And thank you, Rachel, for a really nice paper and presentation here. Maybe I should introduce myself also. I'm a PhD candidate at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. and I work with sort of the role for livestock in sustainable food systems. And I had a question related to a thing that you sort of touched upon in the paper, but didn't elaborate so much on. And that is, and you also mentioned it here, and I'm not expecting that you have the answer to this, but I'm really curious about this, to what extent we can expect that these plant-based substitutes actually replace meat, or farmed meat, as you refer to it. Because sort of from my hypothesis is that sort of the choice to cut down on meat consumption is a sort of moral, ethical choice happening before you go to the supermarket. So sort of the availability of different products in the supermarket, I would imagine, does not influence that choice, at least directly. So in that way of seeing it, I would expect that these substitutes more replace other plant-sourced foods, so that the decision to cut down on meat comes before. But then, of course, there might be some more indirect influences of making plant-based diets more accessible. But I would really love to hear sort of your views on this, to what extent you think that these products actually replace farmed meat.
It's a great question, and I wish I had a solid research base to answer that. We did call that out in our research gaps where more research is needed, and I think it's because when we were looking at some of the existing research on consumer perceptions, consumer shifts, we decided to exclude it from this review, partly because it would just be too much to include in the scope of this review, but also because it seems like the market is changing so dramatically in just the last several years with the influx of a lot of new products, and the conversations have shifted a lot to having these products be more intended for people who like meat and not just vegetarians or vegans who were already replacing meat with other products. That said, we don't actually have great data to show whether these products are serving more of the people who traditionally like meat and would be replacing farmed meat with these products versus vegetarians or vegans who were already eating plant proteins and might just want to try one of these products. So I think that's an area where we need more research. If anyone on the call is doing that research, we'd love to hear it. But I agree with you. I think this is something we need more research on.
Hannah?
Yes, thank you. So I'm Hanna Tuomisto. I'm one of the authors of one of these, or actually two of the papers that have estimated the environmental impacts of cell-based meat, and that were a little bit maybe criticized as well in this your paper. But yeah, it's of course true that the life cycle assessments that we have carried out so far for cell-based meat have many assumptions, and we don't really know if the cells would survive in those kind of systems, and there are lots of simplifications. And also this was really interesting, this paper that you cited by Torres and Vanderberg. Actually, I discussed with Liv and Torres at Cultured Meat Conference in 2017, where he basically mentioned all of these problems that are written in this paper, and he said that he will write a paper about this. So it's true that we don't really know what the protein content, for example, of cultured meat produced in those kind of systems would be, or what the nutritional content would be. There is some criticism that he raised is not really correct. For example, he says that hollow fiber bioreactors would not work, but that's not really true, because now I'm collaborating with the University of Bath in the UK, Marianne Ellis research group, And they have actually tested hollow fiber bioreactors in the lab and found that they work. So it's possible to produce cultured meat in those kind of systems. But then the question related to the fetal bovine serum and how to replace that, it's now like these startups that are developing cultured meat, they have found other ways of producing these growth factors for replacing fetal bovine serum, but these are at the moment really expensive, but it doesn't mean that they need to be expensive in the future, because when the economics of scale basically, and also if they produce them themselves, it's not necessarily that the production costs are that high, but it could be more than that they are expensive because the buyers are willing to pay that much because there is so little use for those things. But so there was one life cycle assessment study that was just published this week that was funded by the Good Food Institute that came out, which is much more detailed analysis than any of these previous ones. And also I'm now working on a new life cycle assessment paper that I hope to submit in a scientific journal during the next few weeks. And in that paper, we actually included also the fetal bovine serum in the assessment, and but also like plant-based.
Interrupt. Can you maybe work towards a specific question to Raychel?
Yeah, so yeah, I have that. I think this is more like a comment more than a question, but basically say I just wanted to comment on those things that had been raised in the paper, and also saying that the new more detailed assessments are coming. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. I appreciate your comment, and it's really exciting to hear that there's more research in this area. I did see that new study that came out this week and was looking at it. What I found most interesting was that the ranges and the estimates, at least for what I had skimmed, I didn't do a full in-depth study, but looked pretty comparable to what had been put forward in some of your research and the other major study on cell-based meat previously. So it looked like the numbers weren't completely off, and that the big overall view, I think, that you found was pretty comparable to what these new studies that are more detailed and actually do test some of the current production practices are showing us. So that's a kudos to you for modeling a pretty accurate scenario, at least based on what things currently look like.
Great. Ximena, can you ask or comment?
Thank you very much. I'm Ximena Schmidt from Brunel University, and I think I really like your study in general, but in particular that you touch base on all the unknowns about these products, in particular, for example, the protein extraction and also all the safety aspects in the long term, and how easy this product seems easy. These products that go out to the market with not really thorough analysis. I guess it's because it's a fast moving market. But what are your thoughts about this sort of safety, or like the public health aspect of these products? And also my questions are, you touch also issues related with ultra processed food, and also this sort of nutrition or the nutrient transitions diet. So perhaps this product help with the environmental aspect, but we have very big unknowns about health. And also the fact that the ultra processed food, then again, is like almost we are replacing like for like, so we are not really changing our like diets in a way, or like this sort of convenience approach to food. So I don't know if you could elaborate a little bit about that, or at least your thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks, Ximena. And yeah, I mean, this is a struggle that we faced in doing the paper, is that we wanted to answer a lot of questions about some of these public health implications, and the research just isn't there yet. And so since we published the study, there has been a few other studies that have started looking more specifically at actual clinical trials replacing farmed meat with plant-based meat substitute product and seeing if it has impact on some of these different factors, but they're not long-term studies. And the bigger implications around processed food in our diets and ultra processed foods in particular, and whether these products are replacing processed meat. So are you replacing one processed meat with a processed plant-based meat substitute, or are people replacing less processed meats with these products? We just don't have good data on that yet. So it's hard to say what the long-term implications will be. But I think that's part of the reason we wanted to do the study, is to kind of call into question some of these bigger picture questions we were thinking about as a public health center and as researchers looking at these broader questions, so that people aren't just thinking in a very nutrient focused way of, okay, well, the calories and protein and the iron are fine, these look comparable, and move on. But like, what are big picture trends that we could be seeing if this did replace a substantial portion of meat in the diets, and what would they be replacing in, and what would that mean for all of us? Even if the environmental impacts are potentially great and animal welfare too, we still want to know some of these public health considerations before it becomes a widespread food and throughout our food system.
Good. I think Jacqueline, you're next.
Hello. So I am Jacqueline, a PhD candidate at Edinburgh. I've been studying the environmental impacts of the Brazilian diet together with Jimena, and my question is pretty much like hers, because I've seen you mentioned in the paper that plant-based meats sometimes can be can be ultra-processed. So I would like you all to explain, why do you think that is? Why do you consider as ultra-processed? And also, how would you classify cell-based meats in considering the level of processing? And the second question is about a kind of social experiment, maybe a personal experiment that I am doing. When I go to the supermarket, I just get all the all the plant-based meats that I can find there. And I'm trying to see how they taste, if they are good or not. So I just wanted to ask you if you have tried, and what are your thoughts about it? Because I'm on this journey of understanding if they are good or not, for me at least, as an alternative.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And I actually was going to say something about the ultra processed food, but somebody has written in, Roberta Alessandrini has written
Yes.
in. Would you like to comment on that? You probably know more about it than I do.
Sorry, I didn't know how to ask permission for a comment. So I'm Roberta Alessandrini, and I am finishing my PhD. I'm looking at the nutritional quality of plant-based meat. So I've conducted a study looking at plant-based meats, looking at the nutritional quality of plant-based meat in the UK. So to answer to the ultra-processed issue, so ultra-processed sometimes is a blanket term so ultra-processed is chips, it's cookies, it's chocolate confectionery, but it's also processed meat. So it's a lot of things. And also, according to the definition, also these products fall into the category. So according to research, these products should have negative health impacts on health. But the ultra-processed food definition doesn't really take into account the fact that these foods might be high in salt or in sugar or in saturated fat. So what I did in my research, I looked at the nutrient content of these foods. And I found, for example, that you can find, so the first thing that I found is that plant-based meat, it has a better nutrient profile than the corresponding animal meat products by using some algorithm, some nutrient profiling model. The second thing is that very often the issue is salt content in this product. Salt is higher in these products. And the other, and the other thing is that I found a big variation. So I don't know, you can find a plant-based burger which has 1.5 grams of salt per 100 grams, which is a lot, really a lot, considering that our maximum limit is 5 grams per day. And I found another plant-based burger which has a 0.3 grams of salt per 100 grams. So together with our group, we try to push for reformulation of these products to make them as healthy as possible. So it just to, yes, that's my contribution to the discussion.
Thanks, Roberta. And I would also add, regarding your question around our cell-based meats ultra processed, that's a great question. We did not attempt to address that just because we haven't seen what the cell-based meats that are produced are going to be. And I think it really depends on what products are out there and how they fit in the nutrient profiles. And partly we didn't make that determination that these foods were ultra processed. There was another study that had already made that claim. So part of our research was just highlighting and summarizing and synthesizing existing research. So that's, if you're interested, I can point you directly to that study that specifically dug in more to the ultra processed issue. But for cell-based meats, that is a question that I think remains to be seen.
Good. I think we got next questions from Isha, and then from Tara, Rob, and Jeffrey. Can you answer them or ask them in that order?
Can do. Thank you, Walter. First of all, Raychel, thank you so much for this paper, and thank you to you and your team for putting together like such a wonderful paper that summarizes where all the holes are. Because so I should introduce myself. I'm the executive director of New Harvest, which is a nonprofit organization that aims to build the field of cellular agriculture, aka the cell-based meats work. And I found it actually quite validating, a lot of the conclusions in this paper, because we always say this field lacks infrastructure and there's not enough independent research and there's not enough research in general and not enough funding in general. And so my question actually talks a little bit about funding, because I really enjoyed the section about industry consolidation, but I thought I was surprised to not see an emphasis on how so much of the investment in this field is VC investment and what potential impacts that could have on, food system once these products enter the market. Because, where my mind goes is this means that these products will be entering the market artificially priced because of VC investment, as opposed to meat, which is artificially priced thanks to subsidies and government and so on. And I was just curious if you had any thoughts about the implications, which I think are quite enormous, of VC entering our food system in such a major way.
Thanks, Isha, and thanks for the comments. So this is a great question, and I think this is part of what our paper was trying to do, was kind of raise some of these questions. But because it was supposed to be a review of existing research and there wasn't any existing research on some of these implications, there really very few. I think there were a few articles that talked about which companies had bought into some of these products, but beyond that, we didn't have much to work with. And so we didn't want, apart from conducting an entirely separate analysis, we decided to stick to what the existing research said. And I think that's where some economists, especially more critical economists, could bring in some of these points, because we're not economists, we're public health professionals. And so I don't have a great answer to a lot of your questions, other than I think it's important and that we should be doing more in that area. And Jan, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll chime in briefly here. So Isha, hello, thank you for your question. I think the simple answer is that this is a very promising food technology which addresses or promises to address a number of pressing issues, especially as regards animal welfare, which I think our paper shows, and the consensus is that would be the biggest win, obviously, compared to conventional meat products, as well as environmental issues, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, it offers a business opportunity. Normally, technologies like this, I mean, I think, as a lot of people in the room will know, don't start being developed by venture capital. Technology is often developed either by incumbent businesses, or it's developed through research and funding, public funding, often research at universities. Cellular agriculture started like this, but there simply wasn't the sheer volume of capital required to fund development wasn't made available by federal governments and wasn't made available by universities. Even the early research at Maastricht University, it was funded by the Centre Novum, the now defunct Centre Novum program in the Netherlands, but had to be assisted by Sergey Brin from Google in order to even create the first prototype patty. And so what I'm getting at is, I think that this is a natural reaction of the market to a market opportunity in the absence of federal funding, in the absence of publicly funded research infrastructure. So the obvious solution, an obvious intervention that I see as being valuable is the creation of something that resembles a real industry infrastructure, which is rooted in public funding, and public funding not just for R&D, but also for research. So people who are regulators, people who are researchers who study these issues would be educated about this, and also so that IP would be developed. I'm thinking here of the work of Mariana Mazzucato, the economist. I think a really ideal model for the rollout for this would be to massively increase public funding, public research at universities to protect IP from VCs and or from large incumbents in the food space from coming in and controlling the IP on this technology, and then as much as possible farming out the IP to the private sector for commercialization, right? The private sector is really good at commercializing. It's really good at getting products to consumers. It's good at packaging those consumers in a way consumers will like. But I think the big question here and the big threat of VC control over this production system is control over IP. And with control over IP means things like access to public information or to researchers about production inputs, about the impacts of production inputs, about possible sort of, be it environmental or health externalities of the production process, right? And we're not seeing this. So this is a technology which is being driven by VC, not because it inherently lends itself to VC, but because VC is the only group that has the capital and is willing to take the risk on the large scale development of a completely novel food product.
Yes, very well said.
That's as quickly as I can answer that question.
And a lot of people ask me, why haven't governments supported this yet? And my quick answer is that I think it's because cellular agriculture is kind of homeless, because it's such an interdiscipline between all this food and agriculture stuff and things that are traditionally biomedical stuff, which fell into very clear funding silos through existing funding agencies. So I don't think anything is like an ill will issue here. I think it's more structural issues. But yes, very well said. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So just to say one more thing, and I think you're absolutely right about the question of silo. And I think also these silos over-determine the nature of discussions, especially about cellular agriculture, less so plant-based. Because thinking through a very US-centered lens, cellular agriculture really troubles the sort of strict division between agricultural policy and industrial policy. Which is it, right? And I think what it might force us to think about, Benjamin Wargaft in his book, Meat Planet, says, cellular agriculture is great to think with above all. And I think if it's great to think with in terms of political economy, it really should make us think about the potential for industrial policy at the federal level or state level to shape food production, which until now is absolutely not a way people are even talking about food production, right? And in fact, some people might find it abhorrent to even think about food that way.
I think,
but I think these are the sort of conversations we need to have.
I want to go to the next question because there's still so many questions that people have. I think, Tara, I think you are next.
Yeah, thanks, Walter. Thanks for a very interesting paper. I have one extremely quick question and then a sort of more speculative one. The very quick one is, are there any plans to do something similar with dairy? So that was that quick question. And the second question is really thinking about the role of meat alternatives in the diet and the extent to which its role can be, reformist or transformational. So when you think about the sorts of products that they're producing, it's like, here's some meat, I'm very processed, I'm going to take the meat out in the diet and put in something else. But you could perhaps conceive of a different role for these foods in that they act as a kind of way of zhuzhing up a different pattern of eating that is more inherently, that doesn't take that meat and two veg approach and that is more inherently plant-based. And the only way I can describe this is that I remember a few years ago just reading Unilever's strategy of what it was going to do to promote plant-based eating, and it was going on about its Knorr stock cubes and how this was going to make vegetables taste nice and we were going to eat lots more vegetables. And I found that pretty cynical at the time, but one could imagine a situation where you're looking at developing products that somehow make a whole different way of eating more acceptable and accessible. So it's kind of speculation, but is it the case that these foods have to be just slightly less bad than a meat-based equivalent, or whether they can play that role in just questioning what eating is? Do you see what I mean?
For sure. So to answer your first question, I do have some colleagues who are working on an alternative dairy paper. It won't be the same scope and the same comprehensiveness of a systematic review. They're mostly looking at trends in dairy consumption in the US over the last decade, I believe, but there will be some elements of discussion around the environmental implications and some of the broader concerns as well. And to answer your second question, I think this is one I've been thinking about a lot too. I've seen it suggested that meat alternatives could be sort of a gateway gateway food to eating more plant-based. If people realize, oh, I'm eating a burger made from peas, I didn't think about how I could be reforming my meals to include peas as a protein source. I have seen it suggested, though I haven't seen any research yet showing whether this is actually the case. I mean, one area I'm particularly interested in, and this is not really reflected in our research, but the massive influx of these products into food service and restaurant menus all over the US, and I'm assuming the rest of the world, but I haven't been in every country recently, so I'm not sure. But I mean, it's scaled up tremendously, the number of plant-based offerings on menus, and maybe that will open these places up to offering other types of plant-based foods that are naturally more inherently healthy, with patterns with beans and lentils and pulses being more of a center of the dish. But whether it will shift us away from still having a meat and two veggie norms, I'm not sure, because that will raise questions around the types of foods we eat in general, whether we're shifting towards grain bowls and dishes with beans and grains being a primary component of the dishes, or just less processed foods in general. I don't know. I think that would be, we need more research in this area, but it's a good question.
There's no real incentive to promote meat as a sort of garnish, as opposed to sell lots of it, which you're going to do with the burger. So the kind of the market incentive's not there, but yeah.
We are really getting out of time, but and we can, I think, we can surely move some of those discussions to the informal part. I think Rob is now next, and then Jeffrey, and if we have time, Ximena can ask another question, but I don't know if that's possible. So Rob, yes.
I'll be super quick. Hi everyone, I'm Rob. I'm a PhD student at the University of Birmingham in the UK, looking more on the socio-cultural side of things from within human geography and in the field of the future of food. Tara's asked my predominant inquiry, which is about plant-based dairy instead, but I've got a couple of other questions and a reflection as well. I'll be super quick. I'd like your sort of personal reflection, and anyone involved with the paper, on what it is to write about cell-based meat, something that's very speculative at the same time as making a review of plant-based meat substitutes, which are obviously extant and on the market in a lot of places at the moment. What does it mean to talk about and reify something that's so speculative in that way? Just maybe justify the inclusion of that in this paper ahead of something like plant-based dairy stuff. And my second sort of comment / reflection is in the past I used to work for the Food Standards Agency here in the UK, and I think something that gets overlooked a lot is food fraud and food crime. And I think plant-based meat substitutes in particular are ripe for food fraud and food crime, given their complex composition and the extent to which the value added is associated with brands as well, and dual composition as well, particularly in terms of different quality of product being sold in different markets. Is there any research in this area? I think it's something that gets overlooked a lot in these discussions. So those would be my two questions. That's speculative development of cell-based meat and on fraud and crime as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. So to answer your first question, one of the reasons we did this research was we were being asked questions about what are your opinions about meat alternatives? And I think in the general public, the nuance, the difference between plant-based and cell-based meat aren't as clear or as strong. I think in the research field, it's very clear. And when people start digging into oh yeah, cell-based meat isn't actually available yet, and it is fundamentally different than plant-based meat. But from a big picture perspective, it seems like they were being grouped together a lot as alt meat or meat alternatives. And so that's part of the reason we decided to look at them at the same time. That said, I fully acknowledge and understand that the field is totally different for both of them. And honestly, even the research we were looking at for plant-based meat had not caught up to where plant-based meats were in the market by the time we were doing the paper. So it felt like a lot of this was, we were looking at the research, but also hearing other things that were happening simultaneously that was not published yet, that really hadn't even been put in a great literature yet, but we knew was happening for both types of products. And I think that's part of the reason we opened it up to explore what are the areas that are similar for these products, and what are the areas that are different, and how do we call that out, and what research is needed in different areas to further advance both fields, but also to better understand the nuances and the differences between the two. And then, what was your second question? Oh, food fraud. That's a great question. I have not looked into that at all. I don't know, Jan or Brent, have you? But it's a good point. I had not considered it before.
Okay, then Jeffrey.
Hi, thanks very much. Thanks for a fantastic paper. I loved it. A couple of questions. If I missed it, forgive me, but I don't think you covered the use of growth hormones in farmed meat, and therefore the likely benefit, i.e. the associated problems of eating farmed meat with growth hormones in it, and the potential decrease by not eating farm meat. And the other one was you mentioned zoonotic diseases, but it was like a one-liner, and in the current context that would seem like a massive game changer in terms of reducing farmed meat, particularly intensively farmed meat, and probably warranted a bit more weight.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. We actually wrote this paper largely before the pandemic happened. And so by the time it got into peer review, we could have added more in that area, but it was already kind of through some of that process before we really realized the extent to which COVID is a problem. It has been for the last year. I think it's a completely valid point. And one thing that I've been thinking further about is we could have clarified more that, the potential reduction from zoonotic diseases is much more substantial for plant-based meat, which doesn't interact with animals at all. Whereas for cell-based meat, there might still be a potential, though we imagine it would be largely reduced. Again, there's just not research in that area. So that's part of our struggle with the study, was identifying where we saw gaps and what we think is there versus what actually has been substantiated in existing literature thus far.
Maybe, Ximena, maybe you can ask your last question, and then Raychel, maybe in answering that, you can also give sort of briefer general reflections on this session, and then I'm afraid that other questions need to move to the informal part after this.
Thank you. I'm going to be very quick. Just about livestock in the US, you said that it's mainly grown in cropland. Do you think there are opportunities, or, more than lobbying, but other options to maybe move away from cropland in the case of keeping some of the livestock and reduce their impact in the US?
That's definitely an area that a lot of people are researching and advocating for, the regenerative agriculture space, and in general, just making livestock production more agroecological when possible. We chose to focus most of our impacts in this paper on comparing to industrial farmed animal products, just because that is still the vast majority of products in the US. And I know it differs in different countries across the world, but here, a very small proportion of most of our products comes from production systems that are entirely pasture-based in the case of beef, or that incorporate more agroecological approaches. But I do think it's an area that there's a lot of attention to and dedication to amongst food system researchers, and also amongst activists to push for. And I think we're seeing that at the federal level right now too, with some of the conversations around how policies can support producers. I think probably because it's more, it's easier to talk about than to talk about reducing meat consumption. And so from a policy perspective, it's easier to say, let's produce better than let's produce less. So I think that's part of the challenge in communicating these issues. But I do think more research comparing, especially these products, to more agroecologically produced products would be fantastic. And we just didn't have the capacity and space and enough research to thoroughly do that in this paper.
Okay, thank you very much, Raychel. Maybe do you want to share final reflections now or not?
Sure. So
yeah.
I really appreciated this conversation. It was fascinating hearing from everyone, and I feel like a lot of you are really steeped in different aspects of this research. And so it was really interesting to hear what's currently going on and what elements or areas you're researching that I hadn't thought of. Thanks for pointing some of those out. And I think it'll be, I hope that we can continue the conversation afterwards, not just in the 15 minutes after this discussion, but also via email or future connections, hopefully eventually in person if we ever have conferences in person again. It would be great to collaborate and to learn more about what all you all are doing too.
That's really great. And I'm really grateful both, Rachel, for all your answers and comments here, but also for the participants, all the bright questions and comments that came up here. Yeah, so this is really the formal end of this session. And I wanted to say a few final things. That is, if you have any feedback on this event or on the, or have maybe suggestions for future topics or future sessions that we should organize, please let me or one of my colleagues know. Also wanted to very quickly take the opportunity to promote our newsletter Fodder and our new podcast that we have recently launched. And I think my colleague Matthew is sharing links to these in the chat. Yeah, so I want to leave it there for today. Thank you all very much for your interest and for your inputs here. And for those of you who want to continue the discussion, we'll now have just a very short 1-minute break to give people the possibility to leave. And then we'll continue with an informal discussion afterwards. And that part, I need to say, is not going to be recorded.